It's really good to be here in Santa Fe and to see everybody here and everybody here for poetry. Yay, poetry. We're all so excited to welcome Tracy K. Smith to Santa Fe. Santa Fe, New Mexico, a historical trading center, idea center, cultural confluence, a city different, a haven a place of a haven of artists and those who love art and those who love poetry, because there's something about how the earth and the sky meet here in this place that is beyond magic. Santa Fe was multicultural long before there was such a term. The original peoples of these lands on which we are standing and sitting are the Pueblo peoples, the Tewa. They call Santa Fe Oga Po'ogi, or White Shell Water Place. Those keepers of the land are still here in full force, though you may not think you see them or hear them. They are here taking care of these lands. That is part of the reason why the land still sustains us. Those places in which the indigenous caretakers are massacred or dragged away, the lands are disturbed, and no one will find peace until they acknowledge the story. So, Mado, Mado, we say in Muskogee language, we acknowledge you. And we ask the keepers to notice and care for this young poet who is traveling here among us. Tracy K. Smith was born in Massachusetts and in the early 70s and was raised in Northern California. Her people come from Alabama. Her poetry spirit was fed by the questions that grew within her as she came of age in a trickle-down economics age, MTV, the introduction of the computer, the digital shift, and gangsta rap. After graduating from Harvard and Columbia, she held a Stegner Fellowship at Stanford. Her first book, The Body's Question, 2003, which won the Cave Canem Prize for the best first book by an African-American poet, was quite the breakout book. This book's poetry is driven by that youthful impetus to know the edges of the body, where they meet with the physical realities and histories of the manifest world. The body is memory, she says in this book. Her next collection, Duende, won the John McLaughlin Award from the Academy of American Poets. I have so many favorite lines from that collection. This one encapsulates the concept or person of Duende, where the world I know and the world I fear threaten to meet. We all know that place. Another favorite line is from her poem, The Searchers, is, "Either way, the land went on living." Life on Mars, published in 2012, was awarded the Pulitzer Prize, and deservedly so. Many signature poems here, but one of my favorites is among the quieter of the poems, The Good Life. I think of the poem as if it were a splurge cut of meat wrapped in butcher paper for dinner, carried under the speaker's arm as she walks home after she's been living on beans or ramen noodles, thinking of this poem. And the poem is, when some people talk about money, they speak as if it were a mysterious lover who went out to buy milk and never came back. And it makes me nostalgic for the years I've lived on coffee and bread, hungry all the time, walking to work on payday like a woman journeying for water from a village without a well, then living 1 or 2 nights like everyone else on roast chicken and red wine. Her memoir, Ordinary Spirit, which is anything but ordinary, rather an illuminating story of the poet who was becoming a poet, was a finalist for the National Book Award in Nonfiction. And most recently, Wade in the Water, 2018, which has been called the retelling of the American story. I think of it as a book of origin stories. There is no one story of race, culture, natives, African Americans, America, or Earth. These poems will tell you. These poems are complex, convoluted, with intimate details running zigzag through the whole weave. With each creation, this beloved poet continues to build a legacy of poetry, of our times, of her generation, of our history together as poets and lovers of poetry. We needed this poet, Tracy K. Smith, and she showed up. I am pleased to welcome to Santa Fe, New Mexico, and to this stage, the U.S. Poet Laureate, Tracy K. Smith.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Joy, for that beautiful and generous introduction. I love hearing my poem in your voice. I wish I could just keep it like that. It's just such a delight to be here. This is my second visit to Santa Fe, which is truly one of the most beautiful and special places that I've ever visited. So I feel so lucky to be back for poetry with one of my favorite poets. I thought I would start by reading a couple of poems from my second book, Duende. I think these are the poems that made it so that I had to write Life on Mars. That doesn't quite make sense the way I said it, but I'll read you two poems that I think of as Western poems. And they closed off space for one science fiction poem that I wrote during that same period. And maybe it was just being thrifty with my poems or being stubborn that, caused me to return to that poem and I think push into the very same questions, but through a different vocabulary, which is what I think that we are doing as poets all the time. I know that for myself, I have just about two questions. They're like, what are we doing to each other? And what are we a part of? What is this thing that we belong to? And of course, there are different scales and contexts within which you can try and get some headway in those questions. So this is The Searchers, and it's after the film of the same title by John Ford. It's a very disturbing Western, one of his later films. It stars John Wayne. And in the film, John Wayne plays a dark, kind of hateful uncle, an ex-Confederate soldier who is looking for two of his family members, nieces, I believe, who were abducted during a raid by Comanche peoples. And he doesn't necessarily want to help her when he finds one of them, but his sense of her life as having been tainted by having been fully integrated into a new community is such that he wants to kill her. That's his first impulse, which he struggles with. It's an awful feeling, but I think it's a film that paints a really useful portrait of America, and I know it upset so many people to think of this place in those terms, but I think they're native terms. This is part of the awful conundrum that we emerge from. The Searchers. He wants to kill her for surviving, for the language she spits, the way she runs, clutching her skirt as if life pools there. Instead, he grabs her, puts her on his saddle, rides back into town where faces she barely remembers smile into her fear with questions and the wish, the impossible wish to forget. What does living do to any of us? And why do we grip it, hang on as if it's the ribs of a horse past commanding? A beast that big could wreck us easily, could rise up on two legs or kick its back end up and send us soaring. We might land any moment, like cheap toys. There's always a chimney burning in the mind, a porch where the rocker still rocks, though empty. Why do we insist our lives are ours? Look at the frontier. It didn't resist, gave anyone the chance to plant shrubs, dig wells, watched, not really concerned with whether it belonged to him or to him. Either way, the land went on living, dying. What else could it choose? And this is a more private poem, but I think it draws from similar cosmology. It's called Western Fragment. And I said, we were tired of dry spells, the whole town knee-deep in drought. When air stirred, only bone responded, that empty clack and rattle of a body hungry for some peace. We girls took to wearing dresses, flowered dresses that pointed where the wind went, bore witness, sucked parsley, stroked ourselves thinking leather, like lovers of some drowned outlaw. We'd wake, wishing for something slow down the throat, like mules hitched always to the same spot, hooves wearing their groove into plank. And you said, the crossing was too narrow. By the time we watered the cattle, most of them were half dead. We were too, but we didn't show it. That's not what men do. We pitched our tents, tied the herd, ate what we could kill. A man doesn't have time to think about a woman when the sky's that vast, that bright and near. When a man's on his horse and the sun's behind his back, if the cattle are contented, then he might think about a woman. Women. Thank you. And I think in a way those are the different scales that I'm interested in operating at. One that has to do with what it feels like to live in intimate terms with people that you know, people that you trust. And then the other is, okay, well, what does it mean to be members of this larger thing like a nation or, even something like a civilization? And it's always more interesting to think about the mistakes that we make, I think, in poems. And so that's where my imagination often goes. In Life on Mars, the framework that seemed useful for me was that of science fiction, and then to the extent that my, intellect was capable of the actual universe. And so I'll start with a poem that didn't fit in Duende. It's called Sci-Fi. And, I'm sure maybe you all have known this all along, but it took me writing these poems to realize, science fiction isn't really about the future at all. It's about the present. It's about saying, okay, so if we don't change anything about what we do, what we believe, and what we revere, what will the future look like? Again, it's always more interesting when that is the bleak portrait, and it's usually a bleak portrait. So, Sci-Fi. There will be no edges, but curves, clean lines pointing only forward. History, with its hard spine and dog-eared corners, will be replaced with nuance, just like the dinosaurs gave way to mounds and mounds of ice. Women will still be women, but the distinction will be empty. Sex, having outlived every threat, will gratify only the mind, which is where it will exist. For kicks, we'll dance for ourselves before mirrors studded with golden bulbs. The oldest among us will recognize that glow, but the word sun will have been reassigned to a standard uranium neutralizing device found in households and nursing homes. And yes, we'll live to be much older thanks to popular consensus. Weightless, unhinged, eons from even our own moon, we'll drift in the haze of space, which will be, once and for all, scrutable and safe. I think this is a poem about America. It's called "The Universe is a House Party." The universe is expanding. Look, postcards and panties, bottles with lipstick on the rim, orphan socks and napkins dried into knots. Quickly, wordlessly, all of it whisked into file, with radio waves from a generation ago, drifting to the edge of what doesn't end, like the air inside a balloon. Is it bright? Will our eyes crimp shut? Is it molten, atomic, a conflagration of suns? It sounds like the kind of party your neighbors forget to invite you to. Bass throbbing through walls and everyone thudding around drunk on the roof. We grind lenses to an impossible strength, point them toward the future, and dream of beings we'll welcome with indefatigable hospitality. How marvelous you've come. We won't flinch at the pinprick mouths, the nubbin limbs. We'll rise, gracile, robust. Mi casa es su casa, never more sincere. Seeing us, they'll know exactly what we mean. Of course, it's ours. If it's anyone's, it's ours. As I was thinking about the present and the future and space as a kind of a background for those kinds of questions, my father became ill and ended up passing away in a relatively short amount of time. And my mental terrain, the universe, felt well suited to the questions of loss and grief that I was working through. And so I'll share some of the poems that are written for him. This first one, I love writing poems because they show you what's on your mind or what's on your heart. You start out with a topic or something intentional, and then if you're lucky, the poem swerves in another direction so that you get close to what you need to be thinking about, what you need to bring into language. I think of that when I think of this poem, which I wrote originally as part of this series, the Universe poems, and I thought, oh, what does the universe sound like? And then as I began to read this poem, I realized, oh, this poem was probably a rehearsal for the elegies that I would come to need to write. This is called the Universe Original Motion Picture Soundtrack. The first track still almost swings, hi-hat and snare, even a few bars of sax, the stratosphere will singe out soon enough. Synthesized strings, then something like cellophane breaking in as if snagged to a shoe. Crinkle and drag, white noise, black noise, What must be voices bob up, then drop, like metal shavings in molasses. So much for us. So much for the flags we bored into planets dry as chalk. For the tin cans we filled with fire and rode like cowboys into all we tried to tame. Listen. The dark we've only ever imagined, now audible, thrumming, marbled with static like gristly meat. A chorus of engines, churns. Silence taunts, a dare. Everything that disappears as if returning somewhere. I'll read you a couple of poems for my father. They belong to a sequence called The Speed of Belief. I wrote this sequence in the days after his death, when I woke up and felt that I needed to be near to him. And I didn't know exactly what I needed to say, what I wanted to remember. Often I would turn to a form that would require my thinking to take certain steps or turns, and in doing that, I felt like some of the distance between us and the mystery between us was made smaller. So I'll read you a couple of sections. This is a brief guzzle. What does the storm set free? Spirits stripped of flesh on their slow walk. The poor in cities learn, when there is no place to lie down, walk. At night, the streets are minefields. Only sirens drown out the cries. If you're being followed, hang on to yourself and run. No, walk. I wandered through evenings of lit windows, laughter inside walls. The soul steps amid street lamps, errant stars. Nothing else below walked. When we believed in the underworld, we buried fortunes for our dead. Low country of dogs and servants, where ghosts in gold-stitched robes walk. Old loves turn up in dreams, still livid at every slight. Show them out. This bed is full. Our limbs tangle in sleep, but our shadows walk. Perhaps one day it will be enough to live a few seasons and return to ash. No children to carry our names, no grief. Life will be a brief, hollow walk. My father won't lie still, though his legs are buried in trousers and socks. But where does all he knew and all he must now know walk? Probably he spun out of himself and landed squarely in that there, his new body capable, lean, vibrating at the speed of belief. She was probably waiting in the light everyone describes, gesturing for him to come. Surely they spent the whole first day together, walking past the city and out into the orchards where perfect figs and plums ripen without fear. They told us not to go tipping tables looking for them, not even to visit their bodies in the ground. They are sometimes maybe what calls out to people stuck in some impossible hell. The ones who later recall, I heard a voice saying, go. And finally, as if by magic, I was able simply to go. I guess I want to honor some of the small things that poems are so great at helping us to see or revisit. We were just talking before coming out here about how poetry is like a time machine. It allows you to slow down time or stop it or step outside of it and move around to something that happened in real time too quickly, or that happened and feels so far away. In language, you can get close to it. And I believe that you can look at it more closely than you might have been able to in the moment that it actually happened. And you have the chance to bring the right questions to bear upon whatever it is that you're returning to, which I think is such a gift. We live at such a fast pace so much of the time. So this is a little poem for my husband. Song. I think of your hands all those years ago, learning to maneuver a pencil or struggling to fasten a coat. The hands you'd sit on in class, the nails you chewed absently, the clumsy authority with which they'd sail to the air when they knew you knew the answer. I think of them lying empty at night, of the fingers wrangling something from your nose or buried in the cave of your ear. All the things they did cautiously, pointedly, obedient to the suddenest whim. Their shames, how they failed, what they won't forget year after year. Or now, resting on the wheel or the edge of your knee, I'm trying to decide what they feel when they wake up and discover my body is near. Before touch, pushing off the ledge of the easy quiet, dancing between us. Let's get rid of some of this paperwork up here. It's too much. I think Wade in the Water, my newest book, is still dwelling in so many of the same questions, but the landscape or the backdrop is history. I wonder, I hope that in looking back and listening more deeply to voices that might not have ever been central voices to the American narrative, it might be possible to hear something that could be newly useful, something that could rescue us from the mistakes that we're perpetuating. And so there are a lot of poems in which I'm looking at early America, looking in particular at the institution of slavery and the lives that it shaped. And then the other direction I think these poems are thinking in is toward the earth. I had a lot of fun trying to imagine the universe, and I left that work feeling so grateful. I left New York not too soon after and moved to Princeton, New Jersey, which is, small, it's green, there are animals, and I feel like there are answers in nature. I feel like nature is one of the few remaining sites of the holy, and so part of my attention in this book is turned toward that. Let's see. I'll start out with a poem that's, I think of it as my 21st century lament, or one of them. Maybe every poem I write in a way is kind of that. This one is called Annunciation. Obviously, you'll recognize that title. think of the moment that, Mary in the Bible, an ordinary woman or girl, was told something has touched you and everything is going to be different from now on. And sometimes I yearn for some voice to come out of nowhere to say, everything is going to be different in just the right way. Annunciation. I feel ashamed, finally, of our magnificent paved roads, our bridges slung with steel, our vivid glass, our tantalizing lights, everything enhanced, rehearsed, a trick. I've turned old. I ache most to be confronted by the real, by the cold, the pitiless, the bleak, by the red fox crossing a field after snow, by the broad shadow scraping past overhead. My young son, eyes set at an indeterminate distance, ears locked, tuned inward, caught in some music only he has ever heard. Not our cars, our electronic haze, not the piddling bleats and pings that cause some hearts to race. Ashamed, like a pebble, hard and small, hoping only to be ground to dust by something large and strange and cruel. I'll read you. I was going to read sort of a happy poem, but this is a poem thinking about the earth. I like poems that, and I teach creative writing, so sometimes I'll have my students, say something like, write a poem that is an extended metaphor that the title sets up, and just commit to that metaphor the whole way. I like poems that do that, so this is my attempt to do such a thing. It's called "The World is Your Beautiful Younger Sister." Seeing her as seldom as you do, it doesn't change. The ire, the shame, the fists you must remember to smooth flat, just thinking what they did, what they promised, then took. Those men who offered to pay, to keep, the clan of them lording it over the others like high school boys and their kid brothers. Men with interests to protect and mute marble wives. Men who let her beam into their faces, watching her shoulders rise, her astonishing new breasts, making her believe it was she who gave permission. They plundered her youth, then moved on. Those awful, awful men. The ones whose wealth is a kind of filth. So, in looking back at history, different sources, documents, letters, legal statements, I wanted to hear something that could be relevant. And I feel like these documents said, okay, you want to hear something relevant? Well, listen to this. So I'm going to read you a poem that's an erasure of the Declaration of Independence. And I feel like it just leapt out at me in that way. And it spoke so powerfully, effortlessly, to what I think of as the history of Black life in this country. I think it speaks to other histories as well. Declaration. He has sent hither swarms of officers to harass our people. He has plundered our, ravaged our, destroyed the lives of our, taking away our, abolishing our most valuable, and altering fundamentally the forms of our. In every stage of these oppressions, we have petitioned for redress in the most humble terms. Our repeated petitions have been answered only by repeated injury. We have reminded them of the circumstances of our emigration and settlement here, taken captive on the high seas to bear and this next poem also comes from, the same general period. It is drawn from, I'm going to try and be as concise but clear. It's drawn from the text of letters that a slave-holding South Carolina family called the Joneses wrote back and forth between one another in, mid-1800s. They were writing because there was a family that was enslaved to them. One of the daughters had run away and was presenting herself as having been given permission by her owners to travel and make some extra money. They found out about this and they were torn, trying to figure out how to punish the family, how to keep their example from causing, uprising or unrest in other, enslaved people's families that also belong to them. And I wanted to hear something else in these voices. The history of people who were enslaved is so under-cataloged. And I wanted to imagine that I could will myself to hear the voices of that young woman and her parents. So I collected all, those letters, and I went through highlighting different statements that sounded like they might be speaking against the grain. And this is what I came up with. This poem is called The Greatest Personal Privation, and it opens with a letter that Mary Jones wrote to one of her cousins. This was before their dilemma had arisen, but she was away from home, convalescing, and she missed the company of two of the women enslaved to her, whose names were Patience and Phoebe. And so she said, "The greatest personal privation I have had to endure has been the want of either Patience or Phoebe. Tell them I am never, if life is spared us, to be without both of them again." That seems so frightening to me. So imagine this is Patience or Phoebe speaking. It is a painful and harassing business belonging to her. We have had trouble enough, have no comfort or confidence in them, and they appear unhappy themselves, no doubt from the trouble they have occasioned. They could dispose of the whole family without consulting us. Mother, father, every good cook, washer, and seamstress subject to sale. I believe good shall be glad if we may have hope of the loss of trouble. I remain in glad conscience, at peace with God and the world. I have prayed for these people many, many, very many times. Much as I should miss Mother, I've had trouble enough and wish no more to be only waiting to be sent home in peace with God. In every probability, we may yet discover the whole country will not come back from the sale of parent and child. So far as I can see, the loss is great and increasing. I know they have desired we should not know what was for our own good, but we cannot be all the cause of all that has been done. We wish to act. We may yet. But we have to learn what their character and moral conduct will present. We have it in contemplation to wait and see. If good, we shall be glad. If evil, then we must meet evil as best we can. Father, mother, son, daughter, man. And if that family is sold, please, we cannot, please, we have got to, please, the children, mother and father and husband and all of you, all, I have no more. How soon and unexpectedly cut off many, many, very many times. I'm trying to think. Maybe I'll read the title poem. It's a poem that changed my sense of the shape of this book or the questions that I was asking, because it introduced another vocabulary term into it, which is love. I visited rural Georgia doing research for a project that I'm working on, and I visited a great, number of sites of the, slave history of this country, the dark feeling that these spaces generate or create was weighing heavily upon me. And then I went to a ring shout, and which, as you know, is a tradition, an African American tradition that bears marked connections to West African tradition of song, praise, community. And I went into the space where a group of performers were going to be singing some spirituals and performing together. And one of the women who was one of the performers saw me, and she said, "I love you." And I felt so enlarged by that. And I thought, oh, wouldn't it mean so much if we could look at each other like that? If we could learn that love is not something to be like miserly about and protective of. This particular woman is named Bertha McKnight, and she says that to everyone. I stood there, I kind of broke down, I was pulling it together, and then I heard her say to the people behind me, "I love you. I love you." It wasn't cheap. It felt real. It felt like this huge humanizing choice that she was making. And this is a poem that I just wanted to write so that I could go back into that feeling. It's called Wade in the Water. One of the women greeted me. "I love you," she said. She didn't know me, but I believed her. And a terrible new ache rolled over in my chest, like in a room where the drapes have been swept back. "I love you. I love you," as she continued down the hall past other strangers, each feeling pierced suddenly by pillars of heavy light. "I love you throughout the performance, in every hand clap, every stomp. I love you in the rusted iron chains someone was made to drag until love let them be unclasped and left empty in the center of the ring. I love you in the water where they pretended to wade, singing that old blood-deep song that dragged us to those banks and cast us in. I love you, the angles of it scraping at each throat, shouldering past the swirling dust motes in those beams of light that whatever we now knew we could let ourselves feel, knew to climb. Oh, woods. Oh, dogs. Oh, tree. Oh, gun. Oh, girl, run. Oh, miraculous many gone. Oh, Lord. Oh, Lord. Oh, Lord. Is this love the trouble you promised? Thank you. So that that beautiful capacity is something that I feel like I've been trying to learn a little bit better, and I think it really is a choice. Like, you can decide that you're going to look at someone through that forgiving or embracing lens, or you can decide that they're in your way and you're late and what you have to do is important and they're just a hindrance. And yeah, so these are some thought exercises. This is a poem that's thinking about this choice, and how sometimes difficult it is to make. Beatific. I watch him bob across the intersection, squat legs bowed in black sweatpants. I watch him smile at nobody, at our traffic stopped to accommodate his slow going. His arms churn the air. His comic jog carries him nowhere. But it is as if he hears a voice in our idling engines, calling him lithe, swift, Prince of creation. Every least leaf shivers in the sun, while we sit bothered, late, captive to this thing commanding, wait for this man, wait for him. Charity. She is like a squat old machine, off kilter but still chugging along the uphill stretch of sidewalk on Harrison Street, handbag slung crosswise, and, I'm guessing, heavy. And oh, the set of her face, her brows profound tracks, her mouth cinched, lips pressed flat. Watching her bend forward to tussle with gravity, watching the birth she allows each foot as if one is not on civil terms with the other, watching her shoulders braced as if lashed by step after step after step, and her eyes' determination not to shift or blink or rise. I think, I am you, one day out of 5, tired, empty, hating what I carry, but afraid to lay it down, stingy, angry, doing violence to others by the sheer freight of my gloom, halfway home, wanting to stop, to quit, but keeping going, mostly out of spite. I'll close with this poem. I think of it as, my attempt to write a new myth. And I feel like this is something we should all be directing our energy toward. So much of our sense of who we are, this country, is about, the past, looking backward, finding, like cherry picking these characters from the past that aggrandize our sense of what we're doing, justify our sense of what we've done. I think it's time to write some new myths that might help us be honest with ourselves and make sense of what we must now do. So this is, my little attempt to do that. Everybody should go home and do this tonight. An old story. We were made to understand it would be terrible. Every small want, every niggling urge, every hate swollen to a kind of epic wind, livid the land and ravaged like a rageful dream. The worst in us having taken over and broken the rest utterly down. A long age passed, when at last we knew how little would survive us, how little we had mended or built that was not now lost. Something large and old awoke. And then our singing brought on a different manner of weather. Then animals, long believed gone, crept down from trees. We took new stock of one another. We wept to be reminded of such color. Thank you. Thank you.